My guest today is Daron Acemoglu. Daron is a professor of economics at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. His research focuses on political economy, human capital, wage inequality, and the relationship between technology and growth. He's one of the 10th most cited economists in history, and is best known for his book Why Nations Fail, which argues that institutions are crucial for prosperity and growth.
Thanks, Daron, for being here. It's great to see you again. You always have liked history and institutions and how government performance affects the economy. And I guess as an experiment, this is for somebody with your inclinations a very interesting moment. What have you learned? What are the big lessons about how institutions and governments interact and people interact to produce these very different performances in very different countries?
Well, this has been a distressing time for everybody, but it's also been a time of soul searching for me. Just in September 2019, James Robinson and I published a new book, The Narrow Corridor, where we talk about why democratic governance, liberty, societal involvement in politics are hard things to maintain, and we sort of talk about some of the issues of state capacity. But in some sense, what I realize now is that the situation is even worse than the most negative reading of that framework of that book would suggest. To put it bluntly, I think in 30 years' time, when historians and scholars talk about this era, they will emphasize the colossal policy failures, institutional failures that have both created the environment where the pandemic can do most damage, and also laid the ground for complete inability of institutions in much of the world to deal with them. So in some sense, the sort of fault lines that we tried to talk about in the narrow corridor, A, were much worse, and B, have been hit by a shock that really exploits their weaknesses. And what I have in mind is two things in particular in terms of the fault lines. One is inequality. So, I have always thought inequality creates a lot of social problems, but I had not seen how the health inequality and inequality in access to public health measures, healthcare system, and other support mechanisms would be so badly exploited by a particular shock of this sort. So that's one thing. So when you look at where the deaths are, where the damage is, it's really very, very strongly correlated with people with bad socioeconomic performance over the last several decades, worse health conditions, low access to healthcare. And that there's quite a bit of the difference between, not by any means, and I'll come to that, but quite a bit of the difference, say, between Germany or Denmark and the US and the UK can be explained by those health inequality differences that were pre-existing. But even more ominous, in my opinion, is that this pandemic hit the particular fault line created by the erosion of state capacity. I think the most jarring aspect of this is the CDC. If you look at the CDC,
the Centers for Disease Control for our
Center for Disease Control, which is the first line of defense and second and the third line of defense in the US against pandemics and diseases, infectious diseases. It is an institution that has a illustrious past. It has done very well in a number of different crises. It was ahead of public health measures in the past, even as recently as the Ebola crisis. I think it really got full marks in terms of how quickly it dealt with problems. I mean, it's been a colossal failure. it has been an unmitigated colossal failure. Can you imagine? Like, look, let's look at this. I think these are facts that we should be screaming about more. Can you imagine an institution that's about infectious diseases, where essentially everybody in that institution, consumes and thinks about disease epidemics and SIR models and things like that before breakfast. And in early January, they get information about a disease that has an R0, basic reproduction number, of almost 3. That has a mortality rate, certainly greater than half a percentage point among the infected, so probably much worse, but probably around that time, around that, if you take the whole population. See, they should all be panicking and taking measures in early January. And this institution does nothing for 3 months until March. It's unbelievable. It is absolutely unbelievable. And really, I think it's almost criminal. And where does this come from? Well, it comes from probably the incompetence and vicious policy agenda of the Trump administration, combined with erosion of state capacity in these institutions and demoralization, disempowerment. But it is just an incredible situation. This is what you expect from Nigeria, not from the United States.
Now, we talked a lot about the causes. I wanted to go to the consequences now. There have been some pre-existing trends you talk about and create those fault lines you were referring to, inequality and globalization, or unconstrained globalization in some cases. Let's start with inequality. Inequality between people who can work at home and can't, inequality between information workers who tend to be on the top of distribution and the bottom, inequality between old and young, inequality between access and non-access. Well, all of these things seem to be not only important, but they seem to be accentuated by the illness and by the epidemic, and actually worsened. Is that how you see it? Is this illness?
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, it's another. We'll come back to. I would love to talk about the part actually I've thought most about is, what we can do and what the future might hold. Not that I have definite answers, so we'll come back to that. But you're 100% right. Yeah, this is an unequalizing crisis. And I also worry that part of the reason why we, the more fortunate ones, are not as exercised about some of the consequences of this crisis is because we're not feeling them. 2 aspects I want to emphasize. Actually, 3 aspects, sorry. One of them we've already said, but I want to reiterate it. The consequences are very much unequally distributed between those who have good health conditions versus those who do not have good health preconditions, which tend to be the poorer people. Second, those of us who are in the global intellectual elite, we're working from home. Our incomes are not disrupted. We're not losing our minds because we're busy Zooming all day in conferences, talks, and stuff. It's the manual workers in the hospitality industry, construction, production, who have lost their jobs. So this crisis, when people talk of the trade-off between economics and healthcare outcomes, they're really not taking into account the distributional aspects of this, which I think is really, really first order. It's not like you're just saving GDP by doing the right economic adjustments. You're actually saving the livelihood of the most vulnerable people in this pandemic. The most vulnerable in terms of health are those with pre-existing with comorbidities and the elderly. So we have to protect them. But there are also tens of millions of very vulnerable economic workers that we have to find ways of dealing with it. And poultry unemployment insurance isn't going to be the solution. We have to find ways of better policy, like testing, tracing, finding smart ways of opening up the economy. The third, I think that's also very important, education. Those who are in good schools, they are continuing to learn through Zoom. Their teachers are adapting. And if you look at people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds who were going to schools where their possibility for upward social mobility was already hampered, they're completely stopped learning. It's really tragic what this is going to imply for next generation's educational inequality.
What should we be doing about that? What's the right policy response?
Well, we're now getting into the future, I would say. So there are two aspects: short and medium term, and medium and a little bit longer term. So the one, I think the longer term, the medium long term is really important. That's when we have to really rethink our institutions and how we can sort of deal with the next crisis, as well as the incipient destruction of our institutions. But in the medium term, in the short term, I think the solution is very clear. I mean, we have the example of South Korea, Taiwan, Germany. First of all, testing, tracing, the right type of quarantining, isolation, those are absolutely critical. I mean, the US, which spends 18% of GDP on healthcare, that has the most dynamic healthcare industry, it doesn't have tests. How is that possible? The US, that has the world's largest 5 companies that are all tech companies that do tracing for their own profit maximizing objectives every minute of the day, over billions of people. And they cannot do the right type of tracing for what's going on to individuals. I mean, this is just insane. It's a failure of leadership. It's a failure of companies, corporate world as well. But we should also think about lockdowns in a better way. I mean, I think, saying that we're going to lock down the economy, but then you leave the nursing homes exposed. That's exactly the opposite of what you should be doing. You should be segmenting the most vulnerable population, minimize their interactions with the outside world. For a long time, people could go into, even though in the peak of the epidemic, people could go into nursing homes without any checks. Nursing home employees were not checked, and they were going home and getting infected in other jobs and going back to nursing homes. Infected people in nursing homes were in beds next to non-infected people. So we're doing that sort of thing, and then we're locking down the most productive part of the economy that have no other economic opportunities, when you can think about partial openings of the economy, especially for essential workers, but also for other purposes that's not going to compromise social distancing. So again, all of these are A, possibilities, but B, very importantly, they are things that require expertise, technical knowledge with good judgment and good debate and deliberation to be considered. No chance of that in the United States today. I don't think the UK is as bad, in as bad a situation, and certainly I think Italy is not in as bad a situation as the US right now. And I think Europe can really distinguish itself. I mean, I think one, again, now sort of segueing into the medium term, I have long thought that Europe has more of a responsibility to act as a global leader of values, democracy, liberty, because the other two poles, China and the United States, are clearly failing. And I think this is Europe's chance to do that. The European Union, as well as the national governments, to actually sort of pick up that mantle of saying, we are going to try to be the beacon, not the United States. The United States is a faulty beacon. We can do better despite our differences, despite our institutional sort of shackles that make the EU not act effectively in ways, and make the national governments have lots of problems. But still, despite those, we can do much better, both in terms of saving lives and saving institutions.
If you see this, we see clearly that expertise is needed, that we need to rescue, etc. Do you think the reaction? I've seen you skeptical about whether Trump and the other populists were going to suffer as a result of this, because they're going to mobilize all the bad sentiments, the aggression against foreigners, elite, whatever. But the other possibility is that people actually learn from this, that you actually need experts, that you need good government, etc. Do you think populism really will emerge successful from this test in which they have done so badly?
So excellent question, and this is actually what I've been thinking about. Again, my thinking is very colored by what I wrote in the past, even though, as I admitted at the beginning, I recognize parts of it need to be changed, modified, uh, augmented. So in Why Nations Fail, the earlier book that James Robinson and I wrote, we introduced this notion of critical juncture, where there is a big shock which enables institutional change, but the specific direction of that big change can go is going to be determined by what coalitions form, pre-existing balances, pre-existing institutions, constraints, and luck. So I think we are very much at a critical juncture. I don't think we are going to see the same movement in every country. I think we're going to see divergent changes in institutions and divergent changes in human welfare, inequality, state power, and so on. And there are essentially four futures that are available to us. One is exactly where you started from, which is, doubling down on what we have, which is ignore the problem, continue the erosion of institutions. That's exactly what Trump is going to try. And if he wins in November 2020, he will certainly implement that, and in a much speedier way than even I had feared, and I had feared that very strongly since 2016. So I think that is a real possibility. I think there will be countries that go down that way if Brazil doesn't get rid of its own bumbling president, that Brazil will go down that way. Italy may still go down that way, depending on whether Five Star or Salvini capitalize on what's going on. And the U.S., I think, the biggest prize for the right-wing nativistic populists. It could go down that way. But I think if that's the case, that's just laying the scene for the next crisis, which will be an even more existential threat to the health of democracy, and probably we'll see things that we never thought we would see in our lifetimes or in our children's lifetimes, in terms of collapse of institutions and complete change in the trajectory of the West. Second possibility is that we learn the wrong lessons. We emulate China. And I call that sort of a China light strategy, meaning that we take the wrong lesson that all we need is a more authoritarian government. We learned the wrong lesson that China's success came from, silencing civil society, getting rid of constraints. Actually, I think that's quite the opposite. That's where their failures originated from. And we try to emulate China by weakening civil society, weakening democratic institutions, weakening liberty. But then we'll get something much worse than China, because China, its success actually came not from authoritarianism, but from the competence of the bureaucracy, which is embedded in an authoritarian structure, but it has a history of 2,500 years. And parts of the bureaucracy, despite their subservience to the Communist Party, could have built quite a lot of expertise. And we're not going to do that. So we'll just get the authoritarianism, but we won't get the good parts of it. So it's more like what James and I called in the narrow corridor, a paper leviathan. We continue to fail in understanding the value of state capacity, expertise, technical knowledge, but we just get the authoritarianism. The third is yet another dystopic outcome, I think, which is corporations rise at the expense of the state. So because the state becomes so disqualified and disreputed with its failures, that people turn to corporations and give them even more power. So the US government cannot do anything, but perhaps Apple and Google can help us. And we give up our privacy, we give up our protections, but we get more and more of the dominance of a few companies. And I think that is also not a future that many people will want. And that's why I said Europe has a very important leadership there. I think Europe has been, despite its failure, despite its governance miscoordination and everything, has been at the forefront of protecting privacy. I think GDPR was a great idea. It has failed. I don't think it has achieved any of its objectives, but at least as a reaffirmation of values, it was great. And it has been at the forefront of antitrust policy, which has been very important in this global economy.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why I think that the European role here is very, very important. But I think the fourth one is the future that I think we didn't grasp, but it's not an easy one by any means, that we realize that we require much better social safety net, much better social expertise, and greater trust in institutions to be earned. That doesn't get given, it gets earned. So that's a process. And we need to actually increase the responsibilities on the shoulders of governments, because we are dealing with truly global complex problems, and this is not going to be the last one. Look, how is that going to work? I think the way that's going to work, if it's going to work at all, and that's why it's not an easy outcome, is that we need to strengthen state institutions and their ability to deal with these problems, including pandemics, but other ones too, including inequality, globalization, and so on. But at the same time, we have to strengthen our democratic institutions so they are on a par with these strengthened Leviathan. Look, I'll give you one example of what I want. What I mean here. Before this crisis, I was probably at the extreme of thinking privacy was very important, and that, terrorist threat or no terrorist threat, you really have to, rein in institutions like the NSA, the UK or the European equivalents, CIA, and protect individuals, because that's actually vital for the durability of democratic institutions. But in the midst of this pandemic, I have no time for people who say, and I know many computer scientists who say that, for example, who say, oh, you cannot have tracing because that would be a violation of privacy. That's exactly the wrong way to think about it. Of course, during this pandemic, when potentially hundreds of thousands of people more can die in the United States, you have to suspend all of these issues and deal with the pandemic. There's no other way, but you have to do that together with a renewed and credible commitment to even stronger institutional safeguards and even stronger privacy once the crisis is over. And there is only one way of doing that. That's actually doubling down on democracy, strengthening society's commitment to get involved in politics, kick people like Trump out of office, and keep the next generation of politicians, whichever party they are from, much more in check and much more on their tiptoes.
This difference between your futures 2 and 4 and authoritarian Leviathan that just grows and a state that grows under control and that we can shrink back interests me a lot. I mean,
I would say not just shrink back. Some of it is shrink back, some of it is not. Some of it, if we leave it, like after the Great Depression and World War II, it did not shrink the state, but we controlled it and we made sure that it uses its power for mostly, not all the time, but mostly for things that we want, like a social safety net, social security, healthcare, and so on.
I mean, you wrote in the Why Nations Fail very eloquently about states that succeed are states that are kind of controlled, that have limited powers, that have to be accountable, etc., etc. And when the state has to start limiting itself is when private initiative has been growing. So I'm curious about this point you were just raising, which is every time we've had a crisis historically, the state has grown, it hasn't really gone down. How do we separate this, making the state, enhancing the state capacity, making the state able to deliver better without having the state interfere with private initiative to an extent that it suffocates us? How do we do the two things?
Well, I mean, I think, look, again, this is exactly, and this is how we ended the narrow corridor. We ended the narrow corridor with a discussion of Hayek. Hayek was very concerned about the rise of the administrative state, the state that spends more, controls things, provides insurance, sets minimum wages. He was exercised about the Beveridge Report. And a superficial reading might say, well, perhaps he was right. Look at the tax revenue in GDP that rose up during World War II and stayed up in all places. But of course, Hayek was completely wrong. the welfare states that grew after World War II, A, did exactly what those populations wanted. They weren't against the populations, they were for the populations. And B, they also underpinned the most glorious period of economic growth in the West. I mean, we've never had anything like that in history, where about 30 countries have all grown for about 30 years, or about 2-3% a year, and this has been associated with actually every part of the income distribution benefiting from this growth. We have never had anything like that. And how did this happen? Well, these additional powers of the state were actually put to use for things that the state actually had a responsibility and the society wanted. And it took place very simply because it all was accompanied with a deepening of democracy. Democratic politics got stronger, not weaker as a result. And that's exactly where we sort of bring the thesis of the narrow corridor. This is what we call the Red Queen effect. The society runs as fast as the state so that the two keep up with it. And that's what Hayek didn't see. And the other mistake he made is that he was too wedded to a notion of liberty, which just meant the state doesn't interfere, ignoring the fact that liberty is hollow and meaningless when you are hungry and you're worried about losing your job and your children going hungry. So the social safety net actually has a very important part in real effective liberty. So I think it's the same situation, that we have to find a way of doing that. Greater responsibility for the state, but the state is more shackled, more subservient, more servant, not master to society.
Let me ask you a very final question, since we're coming to the end of the time, on globalization. We saw a very strong trend over several decades towards opening markets, free capital movement, free movement of people. And there are several things now that make us doubt whether this is going to continue after the coronavirus. One is, will we have as much freedom of movement if people are scared of viruses, if this is not really over? Second, do we start considering value production chains that need to be in a particular country in order to avoid depending on other countries for our purchases? Do you see globalization turning back, or do you think this is just a provisional thing that we will go back to the old?
I think thank you for asking that. I actually wanted to comment on that as well. And I think the future of globalization very much depends on the future of institutions. It's different under the different scenarios that I have outlined. In some sense, it's natural because this crisis has shown both the worst and the best parts of globalization. For the worst part, even in the European Union, which coordinates everything, healthcare systems are not coordinated. But in a world of pandemics, how could that be? Governments do their own policies, lie to each other, hide information. Again, that's the real problem of globalization. And there's a lot of fragility there because of the global value chains. Again, those are problems. On the other hand, we're also seeing the best part of the globalization. There is a real global scientific cooperation that's just amazingly uplifting during these sad times. If the Chinese scientists had not published the RNA of the virus, the efforts for producing a vaccine would be at least 2 months delayed from where they are now. Again, an amazing example of global coordination. But also, on the worst side, we're seeing the colossal failure of WHO. Of course, I disagree with everything the Trump administration does. So they're completely wrong in everything they do, just as a blanket. But they are not wrong in saying that WHO has been a colossal failure. Whatever I said about the CDC goes for WHO. They were cowed into submission by the Chinese and did not raise flags, did not stop travel. I mean, international travel should have stopped in January when WHO had enough information to understand the nature of the pandemic. It is, again, criminal that they didn't do that. So what we need is a much more muscular global institutions. I think that's the most important thing. If globalization is going to work, we need truly muscular supranational institutions. Again, we have a lot to learn from EU. Failures, but huge successes as well. Again, we have to take our hat off to the EU project because, I mean, given how badly WHO has done, That shows how difficult these things are. And the fact that EU has managed to do so many things over the last several decades, it's really an amazing achievement for humanity. But let me tell you one other thing. I think we have to rethink globalization in other respects too. The global value chain, there is an argument to be made that it went for efficiency at the expense of everything else. But if you really factor in fragility, do you really want to create a global value chain, a supply chain that extends to tens of thousands of miles just for like 2% or 3% cost savings? I think when you take the fragility and all of the additional, including the carbon footprint that actually creates, perhaps you say, well, look, I'm going to trade off a little bit of cost savings for creating more unity in my supply chain. So I think those are questions that we have to ask. That doesn't mean an end to globalization, obviously not, but it means, we have to sort of apply a more holistic standard.
We are left wondering what's it going to mean for the developing countries who have profited so much from globalization. I mean, if we start inshoring everything, are they going to be able to continue growing at that speed? But I guess, I don't know if you want to say two phrases on that.
Well, I mean, I think that's actually a very good question too. I think that era of very fast growth because of globalization was already over because of automation. The classic path that South Korea, China have pursued, Vietnam started pursuing, start at the very bottom of the value chain with labor-intensive products, exploiting your cheap labor, and then graduate to higher levels. I don't think that's feasible anymore, because automation means that parts of the value chain are going to be at home done by specialized software, robots, and other automation technologies, and are never going to be outsourced to the same extent that they were in the 80s and the 90s. So that was already going to change. So I think it's a good time to rethink.
Thanks very much, Daron. It was really, really a pleasure.
Thanks, Luis.
I learned
a great pleasure talking to you again.
Yes, fantastic. Good luck with everything, and keep safe and keep healthy.
You too.
Keep working.
Keep me posted, Luis.
Thank you. All right. Thank you. Bye-bye.